Some of this stuff sounds like it would be kind of hard to prove. Like, for instance, the people not being allowed to eat. I guess you could find witnesses, people who are involved with the production, who would be able to testify to that. The idea of somebody being locked in a hotel room, 15, 20 years ago, it feels like that would be kind of hard to prove.
Well, Dawn's testimony is evidence.
Okay.
And I always remind women, because it's usually women who are victims of these things that I represent, that a woman's testimony is evidence in a court of law. And even standing alone, it can be sufficient. Yes, I like to have additional evidence to back it up. But I think when Dawn takes the stand, and of course other witnesses will come in to corroborate, I think she will be believed. And I look forward to taking Sean Combs's deposition. That will be coming hopefully in the next few months. And I may have to go to prison in New York to take it there, which is fine with me.
And so how would that work? You basically get to sit down with him and ask him whatever you like for a period of many hours?
That's exactly right. So we sit around a table like this. He's sworn to tell the truth. It's the same oath that you take in a court of law. There's a court reporter who takes it down. There's a videographer, and I ask him questions that are relevant to the case.
Right.
And he's required to answer my questions.
And so he has to take part in this. There's no chance for him to duck it or avoid it, as I'm sure he would like to.
I'm sure he will duck it and avoid it and delay it, and his attorneys will do everything possible. But ultimately, every party in a lawsuit has to sit for a deposition. So you can't get out of it. You can delay, but you can't get out of it entirely.
Okay. And so, this is one thing that I commented on the podcast recently, which is that when I take a look at all of the things that might eventually come down on Puff from a federal perspective, it seems like the things that he's most likely to not be able to avoid are the things that we might not find as objectionable on a moral level. And specifically, I was referring to the transporting of drugs, which is, that seems like something that he's almost certainly guilty of, is like employing people where it was basically part of their job to be transporting large amounts of drugs that are probably being consumed at these freak-offs. And that's to say nothing of the allegations that they were being administered against anybody's will or whatever.
Right.
But if you've got guys working for you and they're helping you to transport large amounts of Molly or whatever, then you're probably, that seems pretty clear cut. And then also just the prostitution thing is that if you've got women who are being paid for their services and they're being flown all over the country or along with you on these trips and stuff, that seems like another thing. It's going to be really hard for him to avoid that. And you don't have to care about anybody's testimony to make those charges stick. Is that an accurate description?
Well, yes and no. So I think you're right. Those are easiest to prove, but that's not really what he's being accused of in the federal criminal case.
Okay.
And certainly not in our case. And by the way, our case, we filed it a week before the criminal case, and the criminal case really mirrored the allegations in our case.
And that was just a coincidence.
Yeah. I mean, I would think it was a coincidence. It's not really a coincidence in that a lot of people are making the same allegations that Sean Combs. Maybe that's because it's true, right? So he's not really accused of drug charges. And he certainly isn't in our case. I think drugs should be legal. I don't care if adults want to do whatever drugs. That's their body. They can do whatever they want. The issue, as you point out, is consent. And clearly nobody should be tricked into doing drugs, forced into doing drugs. It should always be consensual. And the same thing with sex. I don't really care about prostitution. If that's what adults want to do, I think it should be legal.
Right.
It's their body. They should have a good time. But nobody should be coerced into prostitution as a condition of, say, getting a recording contract. And, you're obviously very familiar with the music industry. My intersection with the music industry is always in sexual harassment and sexual assault cases. And in my opinion, the music industry is probably tied with the fashion industry for the worst treatment of women.
Really?
That women are overly sexualized. They're forced into sexual relationships they don't want to be in. Years later, they come back and they say, I was drugged against my will. I was forced. I was told I wouldn't have a future if I ever spoke out against this guy. And the Me Too movement is long overdue to hit the music industry and the fashion industry. In the same way it has really hit the movie, film, gaming industry. And I think they've really cleaned up their act with regard to women. But with the music industry, I mean, women are just still very much objects, tossed around, treated like second-class citizens. And there's a lot of people out there who have really been hurt by it.
Why do you think the music industry is so behind Hollywood in that regard?
I think there's sort of this, rock and roll attitude of, we're bad boys, and we're going to do whatever we want. And I mean, look, I'm a huge music fan. I love that kind of edgy aspect of the music industry. But I can tell you that there's a lot of women out there who have been really hurt. And I don't think the music industry has taken the Me Too movement seriously. And perhaps this will force it. There have been some cases, but for the most part, I think the music industry has turned a blind eye to sexual assault.
Interesting. Okay. And so in terms of Diddy's possibility of having his career return to normal, do you think that there's any chance of that? Or from your perspective, is that ship pretty much sailed?
I think he's in prison for the rest of his life.
The rest of his life,
And I
really?
think he should be.
Wow.
Because I know what the victims' stories are and how many women he has harmed, and men, but mostly women. And, the fact that he was denied bail is huge. Most people get bail. And why was he denied bail? Because the prosecution argued and the judge agreed that he was tampering with witnesses. And that was in my case. So what happened in my case was we filed Don Richard's complaint. A couple of days later, only one person spoke out publicly against Dawn and basically said she was a liar. That person, it turns out, the government, because they had tapped Diddy's phone, Diddy had over 100 contacts with her between the day we filed the complaint and the day she spoke out against my client. After that, there were 0. So it certainly looks like, and the government argued, he was trying to get her to come out publicly and make a statement to slam my client, Don Richard. It looks like he's tampering with witnesses.
And he personally was doing it. It's not like he had somebody who worked for him do it.
Personally was doing it. And they also had a recording of him saying, I know the government's tapping my phone. I can't really talk to you. Okay. So, I mean, the guy's not as bright as he probably thinks he is. Okay.
I think he was riding a tidal wave of ego for like the past 20 or 30 years. It feels like there's so many decisions that he made that if he had been in any way really like concerned about his future, or if he had been as risk adverse as the average person is, that he probably wouldn't have done a lot of these things.
I think you're right. I think riding the tide of ego is a very good way of putting it. I know that the feds also got a lot of drugs in the hotel room when they came and arrested him. I don't know what. Which
is also kind of shocking, because you'd think that if you were going to New York because you knew that you were about to be arrested, that you would probably, I don't know, maybe even just keep your drugs in someone else's hotel room.
Yes, but I mean, I think he's probably an addict, and so he probably wasn't thinking clearly. And if he hadn't hurt so many women, I would have sympathy for him as an addict, but I don't have any sympathy for him. And I think he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life. I was surprised that the government argued he should not get bail. I thought he would get home confinement and he would have to pay for it, and that's what happens a lot. And that's not what happened. The government said he should not get bail. They had a good argument with this witness tampering, and the judge agreed. And he's appealing that. Maybe it'll get reversed on appeal. Probably not, because he's being prosecuted under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the TVPA on the criminal side. I do a lot of TVPA cases on the civil side, and the presumption in TVPA cases is that you don't get bail. So he's in jail. Of course, he has to be convicted in order to get a prison sentence. I think the evidence is probably overwhelming because they got his hard drives.
And so we've seen a large percentage of the music industry basically remaining completely quiet about this. I think part of that is just like this hip hop code of sort of respect and bros before hoes or whatever it might be. And that's not really wanting to throw shade at another fellow black man, successful guy. But then the other theory that a lot of people are constantly floating is that so many people are going to be implicated in this, that there's so many other celebrities who've been present at these parties and possibly even like coerced so that someone like Diddy could have incriminating information about them. Do you think that's likely?
Yeah, let me just first say I do understand the sentiment of not wanting to throw shade at another black man. And I represented a lot of Black Lives Matter protesters a couple years ago who were assaulted by the police. I'm very sympathetic. But what about the black women? Don Richard is a black woman. Most of his victims are black women.
Right.
So I don't really think the race issue comes into it. With regard to people who were complicit, we allege in our complaint 20 different individuals and entities who we say were enablers. And the government, in its complaint that was filed a week after ours, also says that there were a lot of people who were co-conspirators. That's the
Mm.
language for a criminal case. And I think it's time for us all to recognize that these guys don't work alone. Nobody could have this scale of assault and abuse if they just did it by themselves. So I represented 11 victims of Jeffrey Epstein. You
Mhm.
might remember him,
Oh, yeah.
very a predator who also harmed a lot of women. And he had basically a criminal operation with Ghislaine Maxwell, his number two, who recruited women because women will trust another woman more than will trust a man. And she would bring women into the operation for him to abuse. She's now serving time in prison, probably for the rest of her life. So similarly with Diddy, this was a vast operation of, as you say, people, a lot of people around him. If it was just him, he could have abused a few people, but not hundreds or even thousands, which is what I think this is going to turn out to be, including women at the highest levels who would bring people in for him. And, lawyers covering it up with NDAs and publicists and people getting paid off all the time to hide things. I mean, apparently that hotel video, somebody was
50 grand to the house,
approached.
to the hotel or something?
Yeah, I don't know if they actually paid it or they were approached to pay it, but somebody leaked it anyway, thank
Mm.
goodness, right? And I'm sure that, you talked about his ego. I'm sure that over the years, people were just paying off people after he did bad things and he just kept getting away with it. And yeah, I think that creates a real psychology of narcissism of I can just do anything that I want to anyone and get away with it because he did for so long.
And he paid Cassie something like $50 million to basically make that suit go away. He's a very, very rich man, but if there's even 10 or a couple dozen accusers, he can't give them all 50 million. It seems like that's probably not on the table. Has there been a discussion with any of your clients that he would be willing to make an arrangement with them, or?
No, we've had no discussion. I don't know that he paid Cassie $50 million, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Okay.
And the biggest mistake he made was letting her file that complaint.
Right.
Because that's really what unleashed everything afterwards.
And it was offered up to him that he could have made that go away. And his lawyers basically said, no, fuck off, file the lawsuit.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was the biggest mistake. If he had settled with her before she filed the complaint, I think he would not be in the position he's in today. But the complaint is out there. He settled the next day, but he can't take the complaint off of the internet, right? And that led, I think, to the government investigation, to so many more victims coming forward. It certainly was a big catalyst for my client, Dawn Richard, who, again, she just wants to make music. She's on tour right now. She's got millions of social media followers. She's very successful, and she just wants to be an artist and make music. But she said, I cannot be silent anymore. And no, we haven't talked to the other side about money. We're talking to them about getting him served in prison, which is taking longer than it should. We've got most of the 20 defendants served now. And we're going forward. This is, of course, yes, it's about getting her compensated for her injuries and for the money he owes her, but it's about so much more for her. It's about accountability, her being believed, justice, people seeing who Sean Combs really is.